Hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you have joined me here today. Today we are looking at Nehemiah chapter 7. So grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. So Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 1. After the wall had been rebuilt, I set the doors in place. The gatekeepers, the musicians and the Levites were now appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hanani, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people do. So Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 2, he says, my brother Hanani. And this was the very man who way back in chapter 1 had brought this disturbing report about Jerusalem to Nehemiah. He was Nehemiah's brother, it says, and one of the first people who told him about the sad state of the affairs in Jerusalem. So we need to see that in Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 2. And his initiative and concern had made him well qualified to govern. Nehemiah describes him as a man of integrity, and he feared God more than most people do. He describes Hanani, one of his co-workers in Jerusalem. He was what God needed every man and woman to use them greatly. He had integrity and he feared God more than most people do. And it means to live with such a deep, unwavering sense of morality and honesty and uprightness, motivated by the profound reverence for God and a commitment to follow him and to follow his will above any sort of personal gain or worldly approval. So it said that he feared God, and in a biblical context, to fear God, it doesn't mean to be terrified of him, but to rather have a deep reverence, a deep awe and respect for God. It means that the thought of displeasing God is a powerful motivator to act rightly. And so this reverence guides sort of our daily decisions and actions, ensuring that they align with God's priorities and his will and not what we want to do necessarily. Bob Utley, a commentator, he says, effective leadership are those who are trustworthy and revere Yahweh. Verse 3, I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. And while the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, and some at their posts and some near their own houses. So a tremendous victory had been won. The walls are now rebuilt. Yet the walls couldn't be a protection just on their own. So diligent watchmen had to be appointed as on the walls as guards, and the gates were to be opened late into the day and closed early in the evening. So it was a time of high security because the threats, they were still out there, and they were told to appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the local people who had a personal interest in protecting their own hometown, they were appointed to protect it. Verse 4, now the city was large and spacious, and there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. Now, if you've ever seen Jerusalem, if you've ever been there, it's not actually that large a city, but here we see the term, it was a large city and spacious. So we kind of need to put a bit of perspective as to why they would say it's large and spacious. So the number of citizens in Jerusalem in Nehemiah's time was very few in comparison to the number of inhabitants that it had prior to captivity. The number of Jews that had returned with Zerubbabel had been about 42,000, a bit over. We can see that in Ezra 2 verse 64 and Nehemiah 7 verse 66. With Ezra there had come some more people, about 1,500. We can see that in Ezra chapter 8, and others had come from time to time. But the whole number was approximately 50,000, which is quite a large population, but most of them had settled out in the countryside and in the surrounding towns and weren't actually in the city of Jerusalem inside the walls. So the houses inside the city of Jerusalem would have been destroyed as part of the invasion and the exile, and much of the homes inside Jerusalem, they were inhabitable. You couldn't live there. And so Jerusalem was utterly razed to the ground by the Babylonians before in 587 BC. So citizens had invested in establishing farms and the walls of Jerusalem, and they didn't really, so those two things that were necessary for survival, but hadn't yet had the opportunity to rebuild the homes inside Jerusalem. Now, they may have been living in homes maybe out in the community, in the countryside. Maybe they weren't destroyed as part of the Babylonian invasion. Verse 5, so my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials and the common people for the registration by families. I found these genealogical records of those who had been from the first to return. And this is what I had found written there. So we'll just have a little bit of commentary before we go on to what was written there. So Nehemiah finds these genealogical records of the families who had returned to Jerusalem from captivity in Babylon under the leadership of Zerubbabel. So he uses these records to assemble the leaders and to assist in managing the work of repairing the homes in Jerusalem. So the next verses, quite a few verses, they list these categories of leaders and the number of men that they were responsible for. So it lists categories of priests, of Levites, of musicians, gatekeepers and temple servants. So this is a list of who Nehemiah is sort of appointing for these leadership positions. Nehemiah officially appoints these men to these important roles in the community. Now, I'm not going to read all these verses, so we're going to skip to verse 61 because it is really just a list of names and a list of numbers. So scrolling down, it goes on for a fair way, all the categories. Verse 15, it talks about verse 60 talks about the temple servants. Verse 61 talks about the priests. Verse 64 talks about searching the family records. So we'll jump down to this area here. Give me a second. So verse 61 refers to the temple servants. So these temple servants could not demonstrate that they were descendants from Jacob. The genealogical records would have supported their Levitical lineage. These had been lost. They had been in exile for 70 years, and to retain these records would have been quite difficult. It would have been very important for them, but they had been lost during that time. Maybe they were lost early on during the time of the invasion, or maybe they weren't brought back with them when they returned. But there's no record that these temple servants are descendants of Jacob. So they cannot serve as priests, and they cannot prove that they're even from the tribe of Levi through Aaron. So imagine if you were one of these people. Imagine that you were a Levite in exile in Babylon. So this is before you've come back to Jerusalem. You're living in Babylon. You've gone into exile. You've been told your whole life while you're under Babylonian control that you are a Levite. That you, because of your birthright, had certain responsibilities and certain privileges. And as a Levite, your heritage had links to the priesthood. You, by your rights and under Jewish law, you had 48 towns in the surrounding pasture land in Israel that were allocated to you. And while you're in exile, you've dreamed of the day that you may be free and then return to your homeland and live in these special towns. You knew you had a role to play in the community, and you had a sense of identity and pride in who you were, and you knew that your role was significantly important to the Jewish community. And when you return to Jerusalem, you return with hope of living your lifelong dream and your calling, only to discover that you cannot prove who you are. So it's like a person who finds themselves stranded in a foreign country without a passport. You now realise you have no land to call your own. You have nowhere to live. Every other person from every other tribe has a place to go, but you don't, and you are stranded in your hometown with no identity. And so the priests could only be from the tribe of Levi. They had to be descendants from Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. And if a man could not prove his connection to the descendants of Aaron, he was unable to serve as a priest. And this is why the genealogical records were essential to Israel in proving that who the Jewish males were and whether these Jewish males could serve legitimately under the Levitical priesthood. So it was important to remember that God's law and the principles don't change just because it's inconvenient. So they still had to uphold God's law, even though they would have been tempted, we'll just won't take notice that they can't prove. We all know that they're part of the family. But no, they stuck to what God's law was, even though it was inconvenient. So some men may have been extremely disappointed to find out that they could not serve as priests, and it must have been devastating to those who no longer could trace their genealogical heritage. And then to be told that they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean, it may have created such a shameful social stigma for them. So they're ordered in verse 65 not to eat any of the sacred food as well. And so this would have been the entitlement of the priests, and they weren't able to be used to minister the Urim and the Thummim. The Urim and Thummim, I'll just quickly talk about what those things are. We don't know exactly what they look like. Some presume they were sticks, some presume that they were stones. It's most commonly thought that they were stones, maybe black, maybe one was black, maybe one was white, and they were used to give a yes or no answer to a specific question. So for example, whether to go to war, yes or no, or what tribes were guilty of particular sin, this tribe or that tribe. So we know that they had the Urim and Thummim because it was referred to here. So it must have somehow survived the Babylonian invasion and exile, or maybe perhaps they had them remade. Leviticus 8 verse 8 says, it talks about the Urim and Thummim being in the breastplate of the priestly garments. Exodus 28 verse 30 says, also put the Urim and Thummim in the breastpiece so that they may cover Aaron's heart, and whenever he enters the presence of the Lord, thus Aaron will always bear the means of making decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord. So there are some examples of the Urim and the Thummim that were used in the Old Testament. You can see in Numbers 27, where Joshua succeeds Moses. You can see in Joshua 18, the division of the rest of the land for Israel. In 1 Samuel, you can see it about Jonathan when he eats honey. You can look at those yourself. And there's plenty of other examples in the Old Testament of where the Urim and the Thummim were used. It's not referred in the New Testament because it's no longer needed, because each of us has the indwelling of the Holy Spirit to discern truth. We don't need the Urim and Thummim to reveal God's divine plan. Verse 66 to 73, I won't read all that out as well, it's got a lot of numbers, but what it is it's the contributions that are made. So the governors gave money to the treasury of 1,000 darics of gold, they gave silver, they gave priestly garments, the heads of the family, they gave money, and then the rest of the people gave money as well. And then they went and settled in their towns. So Nehemiah and the heads of the families and the people in Jerusalem, they donated to the work of rebuilding Jerusalem. So this is not rebuilding the walls are done, this is for rebuilding Jerusalem. And they're donating gold and silver and costly priestly garments to restore the priesthood. So in today's currency, I just looked up in, say, 2025, this would have been, the value of just the gold and the silver would have been about $40 million. These contributions were donations, they were selfless sacrifice, a personal significant financial sacrifice. It demonstrated unity and a deep commitment to what God was doing in restoring the city of Jerusalem. Now that's all I have for you from Nehemiah chapter 7. It's been a pleasure again. I look forward to seeing you when we cover Nehemiah chapter 8. Bye for now.